Before the men arrived, the world outside Ilara Vance's cabin was a mirror to the one within, white, silent, and slowly freezing to death. It began with the wind, a keening lament that rattled the very bones of her homestead. This was no mere seasonal squall, but a low, guttural grief that tore through the pines and clawed at the cabin's eaves. It found every chink in the timber walls, weeping through them like a wraith mourning its own passing. From her vigil by the hearth, Ilara listened, her hands a cage around a cup of scorched chicory brew. Tea had been a ghost for 3 winters now, and sugar a distant memory. But she had salt, a deep, abiding salt in her marrow that she figured would see her through another 5 years. Beyond the glass, the world had surrendered to white. Snow, thick as clotted cream, climbed the window panes in a slow, relentless siege, erasing the meager horizon her small parcel of land afforded. The pastures were gone, swallowed whole. The fence posts had vanished into the drifts, and the barn's great roof sagged, groaning beneath the immense, silent weight. In the profound stillness that followed each gust, one could almost be convinced the world had finally expired. There were moments Ilara wished it had. She had once found a fierce joy in such tempests, back when Alistair was alive. They would move as one, a frantic, laughing dance to bolt the shutters against the coming gale. Their laughter then had filled the small cabin, making it feel like a fortress. They would burrow under a mountain of wool blankets, their infant daughter nestled warm between them, whispering stories as the storm screamed outside, a pack of hungry wolves held at bay. That was 5 years ago, an age. The fever claimed the child first, then Alistair, then the pitying glances of neighbors, and finally the last embers of hope. On the solitary holy day of Christmas, she still wore her wedding gown. It draped over her gaunt frame like a shroud of surrender, perpetually too loose, its whites now a permanent smoky gray. The delicate lace had yellowed, stained by time and the constant soot from the hearth. For all other days, she donned men's flannel and heavy wool skirts, mended at the knees with stiff hide. Her boots, cracked and brittle, were stitched and restitched with rawhide laces. Her hair, which she once coiled and pinned with pride, now hung in a blunt, ragged line against her jaw, sheared off with dull shears when the world ceased to be worthy of ceremony. That evening, she drifted through her own life like a phantom. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, split kindling. She drew water from the barrel by the hearth, its top layer still a sheet of ice, and fed the stove, a cast-iron beast she treated as if its warmth could reach the frozen core of her soul. The silence within the cabin was ancient. It possessed a texture, a scent composed of wood smoke, sharp vinegar, damp wool, and the flat, metallic tang of despair. And yet, this storm felt different. The very air she drew into her lungs seemed to hold its breath, watchful. The thought had occurred to her more than once that this might be her final winter, not from a lack of provisions, though they were perilously low, but from the gradual, hollowing erosion of purpose. One reaches a point where breathing feels like a choice, and waking a small act of defiance. On certain nights, she would whisper to the falling snow, asking if it had forgotten to finish its work, if it was waiting for a sign or for someone. She never anticipated a reply. But, as dusk bled into night, an answer came. The knock was a soft inquiry at first, then more insistent, before settling into a steady, rhythmic pattern. 7 distinct raps, each more resolute than the one before. It was not the sound of panic or pleading, nor even the frantic drumming of a man freezing. It was deliberate, measured, like a formal introduction to destiny. Ilara froze, her hand plunged wrist-deep into a sack of flour. Her gaze shot to the heavy wooden door as if it might betray her and swing open on its own. No one ever knocked. Not in years. The last to do so was a marshal, searching for some runaway farmhand. She had given him a heel of bread and a well-practiced lie.
She drew one breath, then a second, and pulled the door inward. They were silhouettes against a canvas of swirling white. 7 figures, each seeming to stoop to clear the doorframe, their forms bulked by layers of fur, hide, and feathers, all dusted with snow. Warriors. The thought was immediate, instinctual. The chokers of bone, the long dark braids, the unblinking obsidian eyes that met hers without apology or aggression. One of them stepped forward. He was a man of broad shoulders, with snow melting on the high planes of his cheekbones and a pale scar that cut a line across his chin. He lowered his fur-lined hood. "We require shelter," he stated, his voice a low rumble, as if the storm had found a human throat through which to speak. Ilara blinked. A faint, frantic pulse had begun in her chest, a timid but undeniable rhythm. Her eyes moved past him to the others. They bore no visible weapons. There was no menace in their stance, no feral hunger in their expressions, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. The man waited, patient. The gale shrieked behind them, plucking at the edges of their cloaks like a scavenger. She stepped back, yielding the doorway. The atmosphere inside the cabin shifted instantly. Their collective presence altered the currents of heat, the fragile equilibrium, the very density of the quiet. They removed their snow-caked boots at the threshold, an unspoken courtesy. One warrior chafed his hands together, breathing warmth into them. Another knelt before the stove as if in prayer. Not a word was spoken. They had brought their own silence with them, but it was not the crushing, empty sort she knew. This was a silence that listened. Ilara lit a second oil lamp, setting it on the hearth. Her hands trembled as she ladled what remained of a thin root vegetable stew into her bowls. The largest of them, the one with the scarred chin, came forward and accepted a bowl from her. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "Gratitude," he murmured. "There is no other word for it," she replied, with a slight nod. They ate with the slow, deliberate patience of men who understood the true nature of starvation. She watched one of them re-braid his hair, his fingers surprisingly deft in the dim light. Another sat with his legs crossed, using a small, sharp knife to whittle a piece of bone. A third meticulously cleaned his hands with a mixture of snow and lard. They were not bandits. Not tonight. They were sojourners, men who carried the weight of countless miles in their bones. Her gaze kept returning to the scarred one. His face held a certain quality, not softness, but a profound clarity. He did not look at her with the familiar hunger of men. He watched her as a man who had made a long acquaintance with silence and recognized its echo in another. She had not spoken more than a handful of words in hours, but now she found her voice. "There is room in the loft, and blankets." He shook his head slightly. "We will sleep by the fire." The others were already unrolling their bedrolls of fur near the hearth. They moved with the fluid coordination of a pack, requiring no spoken commands, only shared instinct. These were men who had endured winters, conflicts, and things far worse, together. Ilara ascended to the loft anyway. She brought down the fine quilts, the ones that Alistair's mother had stitched before the coldness had claimed her heart. She moved among the sleeping forms, a ghost in her own home, and draped a quilt over each man. She held her breath, moving with the careful grace of a mother tending to unknown children. When she came to the scarred one, she hesitated. His eyes were closed, but his hand moved, gently enveloping hers where it rested on the quilt. It was not a grasp, but a quiet acknowledgement, a promise that he was real, that he saw her. She pulled her hand away, her heart hammering against her ribs as if started from a long slumber. She did not sleep. The wind howled with renewed fury that night. Outside, the sound of snapping branches cracked like gunfire. The snow had now completely obscured the windows, but inside, the fire burned with a steady, defiant glow. 8 souls, 7 strangers and 1 forgotten woman, kept it alive, not with conversation, but with the simple, profound act of being present. In the morning, the scarred man remained, while the others ventured out, returning with a stack of firewood larger than any she had ever seen a single man gather. He offered no explanation.
But when she brought him a weak infusion of her last dried herbs, he presented her with a small carving in return. It was a piece of stone, smoothed and rounded by a river, now shaped into the form of a hawk. She accepted it with both hands, as if it were a fragile, living thing. Their fingers brushed. She yearned to ask him why he had stayed, what the carving meant, why he looked at her with an unnerving sense of familiarity, as if they had met before in a different life. But she held her silence, and he offered a faint, fleeting smile. That evening, Elara sat alone in her rocking chair, the stone hawk resting in her lap. She stared into the flames, seeking answers to the questions her heart was too timid to voice. Outside, the storm was finally breaking, but inside her a different kind of stirring had begun, something ancient and aching and impossibly warm. And just as sleep began to claim her, she felt the wind shift. It was not retreating, it was turning towards something, towards someone. Elara awoke to the pre-dawn gloom, a pale, bruised light filtering through the frost-etched windows. The stove offered the last of its warmth in quiet, crackling sighs. A plume of white vapor escaped her lips as she sat up in the rocker, the quilt still pooled in her lap like a half-remembered dream. For a disoriented moment, she wondered if the entire episode had been a hallucination. The knock, the 7 silent men, the way the silence itself had become a comfort instead of a torment. Then she heard it, the steady, percussive rhythm of an axe slitting wood just beyond the barn. The sound was not hurried or reckless, but measured and intentional, the work of a man who intended to owe no debts. She rose, her joints stiff from the cold and the awkward sleep, and pulled her shawl tighter. The air, even indoors, had a crystalline bite. The floorboards groaned under her boots, and from the main room below the loft, one of the men shifted in his furs. Another coughed, a soft, muffled sound, and then was still. When she opened the cabin door, the wind stole her breath. An unbroken expanse of snow stretched in every direction, waist-deep in places, with massive drifts piled against the fence line. And there, in the partial shelter of the barn's lean-to, stood the scarred man. He was bare-chested despite the piercing cold, steam rising from his skin as if from a forge. His long, dark hair was tied back with a leather thong, and the axe swung in a fluid, efficient arc. A neatly stacked cord of firewood was already growing behind him. This was not a display of prowess, it was simply work that needed doing. She didn't call out, she merely watched, until without turning his head he spoke. "Morning." His voice was deeper in the frigid air, quieter than the night before. It seemed to vibrate in the space between them like the low note of a cello. She took a tentative step forward, her chin tucked into her shawl. "You'll catch your death." "No," he said, the axe biting into another log. "The cold hones the edge. It keeps a man honest." She had no reply for such a statement, so she offered none. Instead, she returned inside and heated the last of the porridge, stirring in a pinch of dried apples she had been hoarding for weeks. When the other men awoke, they did so without ceremony or chaos. They folded their furs, shook the frost from their boots, and waited with a quiet patience for her to fill their bowls. Names remained unexchanged. The lack of them didn't feel like an oversight. It felt like a form of respect, as if each word carried a weight and had to be earned. The scarred man sat slightly apart from the others, near her small food preparation counter. When she passed him his bowl, their fingers brushed again. He did not recoil this time, nor did she. After the meal, they set to work unbidden. 3 of them reinforced a section of the barn wall where the storm had splintered a beam. Two others began the arduous task of shoveling a path from the cabin to the frozen creek. One meticulously repaired the sagging gate of the chicken coop with a length of rawhide. And the scarred one, he returned to the woodpile. Always the axe. Ilara couldn't understand it. Why these men, these warriors whose name was whispered with fear by every settler for 100 miles, were here, treating her derelict homestead like consecrated ground, like something worthy of restoration?
And more perplexing still, why she felt a greater sense of security than she had in half a decade. By noon, the wind had subsided, and the oppressive gray sky began to fracture, revealing patches of dull, pewter light. One of the men, older, with streaks of silver in his braids, sat on her porch, carving a piece of bone with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. He did not seem to speak her language, or perhaps simply chose not to, but when their eyes met, he gave a slow, deliberate nod, a clear message: "We see you. We intend no harm." She tried to imagine the venomous gossip of her former neighbors. A woman like her, a recluse, giving shelter to a band of native warriors in her own kitchen, warming their bodies by her fire. The whispers were almost audible in her memory. "She's gone mad from grief," or worse, the sharp, sanctimonious judgment that had followed her since Alistair's passing. They had judged her then, too. Said she hadn't wept correctly, that she had taken too long to put him in the ground. Whispered that God had surely turned his face from her. But not one of those righteous souls had offered a hand when her roof began to leak or her child burned with a fever. They offered prayers when what she had needed was presence. That evening, one of the younger men, barely 25, placed a piece of carved driftwood by her hearth. It was the rough-hewn shape of a buffalo's head, crude but powerful, a gift. He gave her a single, solemn nod and retreated to his place on the floor. Ilara felt a tightness in her throat. Later, as the firelight painted dancing shadows on the walls, the scarred man approached her small table. In the warm glow of the lamp, she saw his eyes clearly for the first time. They were the color of slate, not cold, but worn smooth, like river stones. His face was a map of stories he had yet to tell. "You are not afraid," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I was," she admitted. "Not anymore." "Why?" She paused, searching for the truth. "Because none of you has taken a thing you did not ask for." Another silence, and then she added, "You are not what they say." She met his steady gaze. "Neither am I." The silence that followed was different again, softer now, comfortable, like two people listening for the same far-off melody. "Your name?" he asked. "Kale." The name settled in her chest, a missing piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. She offered hers in return, "Ilara." Kale repeated it once, softly, as if testing its weight on his tongue. "Ilara." There was a reverence in the way he spoke it, like a prayer that had gone unanswered for too long. That night, as the wind began to rise again, threatening another blanket of snow, the men arranged their furs in the same quiet ritual. But Kale positioned himself near the door, his back to it, a silent watchman. He was not guarding against a threat from without, but for her within. From the loft ladder, Ilara watched him. For the first time in an eternity, she did not fear the encroaching darkness. It felt like a quilt now, not a tomb. She went to her room and gently closed the door. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she could feel the smooth, cool weight of the hawk carving in her apron pocket, now warmed by her own body. She had always believed that loneliness was a kind of death one was forced to live through, but perhaps it was something else entirely. A stillness, a hollowed-out space, waiting for someone who would not demand she fill the silence, but simply share it. She turned down the lamp and stared into the darkness, her breathing even and calm. Tomorrow, the snows might recede, or they might rise higher. The men might depart, or they might remain. But a fundamental shift had already occurred within her, something too quiet to be named, too sacred to be rushed.
And then, just as the currents of sleep began to pull her under, she heard another knock. Not on the main door this time, on her window. A single, soft rap, then silence. She rose from the bed, her heart seeming to rise with her. She drew back the thin curtain, and there he stood, in the swirling snow, Cale. Not with urgency, not with demand, but with a calm, unspoken question in his eyes. And Ilara, without uttering a word, simply unlatched the window. The first hint of a thaw was a whisper, a single fat drop of water falling from an icicle on the eave, then another. The heavy blanket of snow along the roofline began to slump, like shoulders finally unburdening a long-held sorrow.
Several days had passed since the arrival of the 7 warriors. Now, only one remained. Cale had offered no reason for staying. He simply had not left. Ilara did not ask. Each morning, she would discover something new had been mended. A loose hinge on a cupboard door secured with a strip of leather. The firewood restacked with geometric precision. The section of fence line that had buckled under the storm's assault now standing straight and true. He worked without guidance, moving with a quiet purpose. He still slept by the hearth, always rising before she did. At times, she wondered if he slept at all. Their words remained sparse, but the silence that grew between them had softened, become fertile. They moved around each other like two people who had not only been strangers, but were now something far more elemental, sharing a raw, unspoken recognition. It was not yet romance. It was something older. One afternoon, as she stirred a thin broth, Cale entered from the biting cold, tracking in snow without apology. He held a rabbit by its feet, already skinned and cleaned. He placed it on the table without a word. Ilara turned, wiping her hands on her apron, and met his gaze. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head, then added, "Your stores were low." She had never spoken of it. He had simply observed. Later, as the rabbit simmered, filling the small cabin with the rich scent of meat and thyme, she set 2 bowls upon the table, one in her usual place and one directly across from it. It was a simple gesture, but it felt as momentous as lighting a beacon in a vast, dark wilderness. He did not sit immediately. Instead, he walked to the high shelf above the hearth, where a row of her father's books sat collecting dust. He took one down, a worn copy of Walden, and turned it over in his hands. "You read?" he asked. "I used to." Her voice was smaller than she intended. "You still do," he said, his gaze steady. "You have only forgotten how." She did not contest it. That night, they ate in a comfortable quiet. But when she placed her spoon in her empty bowl, he spoke again. "You wear your hair differently now." She blinked, her hand instinctively going to the side of her head. Stray strands had been falling into her eyes, so she had pulled it back from her face in a loose twist. "I haven't had a reason to give it much thought," she said, a faint self-conscious laugh in her voice. "You have a reason now." His words landed gently like flakes of snow on glass. She looked at him, and for the first time, did not look away. But something deep inside her recoiled, not from fear, but from a flicker of shame. She was not yet ready for what he might be offering, or for what she truly might want. The next morning, Ilara created a space between them. She scrubbed the wash basin with unnecessary vigor, gathered kindling with a tense, rigid posture, occupying herself with any task that allowed her to keep her eyes averted. She saw him in glimpses through the window, methodically repairing the coop, wiping frost from the panes, stretching a rope from the barn to the porch as a guide for future blizzards. He did not question her sudden distance. That evening, he found a bundle of smoked, dried meat left on the table. There was no note, only the quiet evidence of his care, laid down like a bridge she had not yet found the courage to cross. Still, she did not cross it. 3 more days passed in this silent tension. On the 4th, while hauling a bucket of water from the creek, Alara's foot slipped on a hidden patch of black ice. Her boot skidded, and she went down hard, her hip striking the frozen earth with a sickening crack. The bucket flew from her grasp. The air was knocked from her lungs. She lay there for a long moment, eyes wide with shock, unable even to cry out. The sky above was a vast, indifferent white. The snow beside her smelled of damp earth and pine, and something ancient, like time folding back upon itself. And then, he was there. Cale materialized from the silence, kneeling beside her, as if the wind itself had carried him. His hands, warm and sure, slid beneath her shoulders. "You have fallen," he said, his voice soft. She tried to nod but could not. Without another word, he lifted her. His arms cradled her as if she were weightless, but it was the gentleness of the act that unraveled her. The way his cheek brushed against hers as he adjusted his grip. The way he instinctively shielded her face from the wind with the bulk of his shoulder.
Inside, he laid her down on the furs by the fire, carefully removed her wet boots, and draped a thick quilt over her. Then he was gone. She closed her eyes, the pain a dull, rhythmic throbbing, not just in her hip, but in places far older and deeper. When he returned, he carried warm water and a pouch of willow bark. He touched her only where he had to, his movements brief, efficient, and careful. His calloused fingers were reverent. "You must rest," he murmured. "I will see to the rest." And he did. In a half-conscious daze, she watched him move through her home as if he had always belonged there. He tended the stove, fed her few remaining chickens, and even rinsed the laundry she had spilled and left in the basin. There was no ceremony in his actions, no pride, only a quiet, resolute presence. That night, Ilara did not sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought of his hands, not of their strength, but of their restraint. When dawn finally broke, she rose slowly and limped into the main room. Her hips still ached, but she could move. She chose to move. She found him near the barn, feeding the horses. He turned as she approached. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You should be careful," he said gently. "The snow still hides its teeth." A small smile touched her lips, not because it was humorous, but because it was true. He stepped closer, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached up with the slowness that felt profound and tucked a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. "You are strong," he said. "No," she whispered. He tilted his head. "You believe strength must be loud." She did not know how to answer. Later that day, she found her small hand mirror tucked away in a drawer and long forgotten. When she held it up, she barely recognized the woman who stared back. Her face seemed less gaunt, her eyes clearer, and her hair, though still unruly, was pulled back in a clean, tight braid. She set the mirror down and let out a soft laugh, which was followed by quiet, shameless tears. That evening, she wore her deep burgundy scarf, the one she had packed away in a trunk after Alistair died. Cale said nothing when he saw it, but his gaze softened, and an entire conversation passed between them in that single, silent glance. They ate together again, and when their fingers brushed as she passed him the salt, neither of them pulled away. When he stood to stoke the fire, she found herself watching the way he moved, the economy of his motion. She noted how careful he was with her meager possessions, how nothing about him demanded space, yet everything about him earned it. "Why did you stay?" The question left her lips before she could stop it. He paused, the firelight flickering across his back. "You did not ask me to leave." It was a simple answer, but it filled the room like a hymn. That night, as she climbed the ladder to her loft, she stopped halfway and looked down from his bedroll. "Cale, will you keep the fire lit tonight?" she asked. He nodded, and she slept more soundly than she had in 5 years. But in the morning, there were fresh tracks in the snow. Not his.
They led to the barn, circled it, and then retreated back into the woods. 3 sets of prints. Not 2, not 1, 3. Ilara had long ago convinced herself that her heart was not made for winter. Not this kind of winter. The deep, soul-starving kind that outlasts the woodpile and settles on the spirit like a tombstone. She had learned to pretend the constant ache was just the weather. But now, something was stirring beneath her ribs. It was not yet warmth, but it was motion, and it terrified her. Kale had returned from the tree line with a brace of rabbits and a grimness carved into his face. He did not speak of the tracks, but Ilara saw the change in his eyes. The quiet in him was no longer just habit, it was caution. That evening, he did not join her at the table. He stood by the window, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound was a rhythmic scrape, almost meditative, like a lullaby made of stone and steel. Ilara stirred the stew, her own fingers trembling slightly. She could feel a tension coiling in the space between them. Not anger, not distance, but a shared vigilance. They were watching the barn, he said, his back still to her. They did not come close, but they were here.
Ilara did not need to ask who they were. In this part of the world, it was enough to know that someone was near, someone with ill intent in their hearts. "I thought no one ventured this far out," she said, her voice thin. He paused his work. "Most do not, but these men, they were not lost." She set the spoon down, her appetite shriveling within her. After their meal, he announced his intention to check the perimeter. She protested, offering to light more lamps or bring the chickens inside, but he cut her off with a shake of his head. "Lamps are an invitation," he murmured. "Let the darkness be our shield." Ilara stood on the porch, watching him melt into the trees, the crunch of his boots on the snow sounding like the snap of dry bones. The cold was a physical blow against her cheeks, but she did not retreat inside. She watched the woods, her eyes tracing the familiar outlines, searching the profound absence, until he finally reappeared, his face chapped by the wind, his expression a mask. "2 miles out," he said, his voice low. 3 men, smelling of whiskey and arrogance." He paused. "Settlers, from the town." That last word landed between them like a rock dropped into still water. Town meant judgment. Town meant the kind of whispers that, if left unchecked, could easily turn to torches. That night, Kael moved his furs to the floor directly in front of the door. He began to carve another hawk, this one rougher than the first, its shape imbued with a coiled anger. Ilara did not ask about it. She simply brought him a cup of the last of her warm cider and set it beside him without a word. He did not thank her. He only watched her hand as she withdrew it and said, his voice barely audible, "You should not have to live this way." She stood frozen in the firelight, unsure how to handle such raw tenderness. "It is how I have lived for years," she said. "Years do not make something right," he replied. Ilara retreated to her chair, pulling her shawl around her shoulders as if it could hold her together. She slept in fits and starts. The snow began to fall again, a soft, muffling curtain. Somewhere in the deep dark, a coyote cried out and was answered only by silence. The next morning, Ilara's body betrayed her. She had risen at dawn to break the ice from the water trough, a chore her body knew by heart even as her muscles protested. The cold bit deep into her sore hip as she leaned over, and her breath hitched in her chest. Her knees gave way without warning. The frozen ground rushed up to meet her before she could utter a sound. When she opened her eyes, the sky was a spinning blur of white. Kael was beside her in an instant. He carried her inside without a word, his hands gentler than the falling snow. He settled her by the fire, wrapping her in furs, and then began to boil willow bark until the air was thick with its bitter medicinal scent. "You are not eating enough," he stated flatly. She lacked the strength to argue. He crushed herbs into a poultice, pressed a warm cloth to her side, and knelt beside her for what felt like hours. Once, she awoke to find him asleep, sitting upright, his arms crossed over his chest, his knife still resting at his side. He was not protecting himself, he was simply ready. When she was finally able to sit up on her own, she found the cabin transformed. Everything was cleaner, more ordered. The floors had been swept, the windows cleared of frost. A small braided bundle of sweetgrass now hung from a nail near the door. "You did all this?" she murmured. He looked up from the stool where he was fletching arrows. "You are not a burden," he said, his gaze direct and unwavering. Her throat constricted. Later that day, Ilara stood before the mirror again. Her hair had come loose from its braid, falling in soft waves she had forgotten she possessed. Her face, though pale and bruised, had color in its cheeks. Her hands were steady. She pulled on her oldest dress, not as a sign of mourning, but of memory. It still fit, and somehow it felt like armor. She stepped outside to find Kael skinning a rabbit on the porch steps. The snowfall had lightened to a gentle flurry, each flake distinct and slow, as if time itself had decided to walk alongside them for a while. "You saved my life," she said. "You stayed," he corrected. To them, it was the same thing.
They worked in a silence that felt more like a conversation than any words could. That night, she prepared the stew with deliberate care, adding dried sage and a single sliver of apple for a hint of sweetness. Kael ate slowly, as if he could taste the effort she had put into it. After dinner, he unrolled a thick fur blanket near the hearth. "I will remain by the fire tonight," he said. She looked at him for a long, silent moment. "You can stay," she whispered, "where you have always stayed." His eyes met hers, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod. That night, she slept to the steady rhythm of his breathing behind her. They did not touch. There was only presence. It was the safest she had ever felt. At dawn, she found a message scratched into a piece of kindling by the stove. Simple, sharp words. "They are coming back." Her breath caught. She stepped outside, the cold a blade against her skin. The tracks were fresh, deeper this time. Men on horseback. 3 of them. They had circled the barn, come close, dismounted, looked inside. She found Kael by the creek, standing perfectly still, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "They know I am here now," he said. "What will they do?" "They will test us." He looked at her then, not with fear, but with a stark resolve. Ilara reached out and touched his arm. "You do not have to stay." His jaw tightened. "I do." Back at the cabin, Ilara fed the stove until it roared. She placed 3 candles in the windows, not as a welcome, but as a warning. She took down Alistair's old rifle from its pegs above the mantel. It had not been fired in years. It felt alien in her hands now. When Kael returned, he carried a small satchel of his own supplies and a look in his eyes she had not seen before. "We could run," she offered, the words tasting like ash. "No, they would find us." He looked at her, his expression softening. "This place is yours. It is the first good thing I have seen in a long time." She held his gaze. "And you?" he said. "I was not meant to survive either. But you gave me fire again." She stepped forward, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I do not want to lose this," she confessed. "You will not," he promised. Then he turned his gaze toward the barn, and Ilara, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, watched the trees because someone, something, was already moving through them. The sound of hooves crunching through the crusted snow.
It was not a rushed sound, not the sound of panic, but of confidence, the rhythm of men who believe the outcome has already been decided. Cale was already moving into the open space before the cabin. Ilara remained near the doorway, the heavy rifle in her hands. It felt like a prop, a lie. The faint smell of rust was the smell of ghosts. 3 men broke from the cover of the trees. They were locals. She recognized one immediately, Jedediah Thorne, a man with broad shoulders and mean, small eyes, who never seemed to complete a sentence without a curse aimed at something weaker than himself. He rode forward slowly, a smirk on his face like a man who had already won the pot. "Well now," Thorne drawled, swinging down from his horse, "ain't this a cozy picture? The little prairie widow with a redskin playing guard dog on her doorstep." Cale remained silent, a statue carved from rock and resolve. The second man, a wiry figure with a scarred lip, let out a chuckle. "Heard you was playing house out here, Ilara. Word gets around even in a blizzard." She stepped forward then, the rifle held across her chest, not yet aimed. "You have no business here, Jedediah." "Oh, I think we do," Thorne sneered. "You just don't like the terms. This here is still white man's country. You taking in a savage like he's your husband, it makes folks uneasy." "He is not my husband," Ilara snapped, and immediately regretted the defensive tone. Cale did not move, not even blink. Thorne's smirk widened. "So he's just staying here? Sleeping in your house? Eating your food? Chopping your wood like a damn tamed pet? Is that it?" The insult was meant to land on Cale, but it glanced off him. He did not flinch, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. His fingers curled almost imperceptibly at his sides, a flicker of the storm within. Then the third man, younger, his face flushed and his hands twitching on the reins of his horse, urged his mount forward. He had a shotgun cradled loosely in his arms. "We just want a word," he said, his voice unsteady. Cale finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "One step closer, and you will have far more than words." The silence that descended was so profound you could have heard a pin drop in the snow. Thorne's smirk curdled. This was not fear. It was a promise. He took that step. "You threatened us, boy? I am promising you." It happened with breathtaking speed. The young, nervous one, startled by Cale's tone, began to raise his shotgun. Ilara cried out, a sharp, splintering sound in the cold air, but Cale was already moving. Not with rage, not with noise, but like lightning given human form. He closed the distance and drove his shoulder into the young man's chest before the gun could be brought to bear. They hit the ground in an explosion of snow. The shotgun clattered away. A shout went up from the others. Thorne fumbled for the revolver at his hip. Ilara raised her rifle. Her arms trembled violently, but she fired. The shot went wide, splintering the bark of a tree just beside Thorne's head. He flinched, and it was just enough. Cale was on his feet again, hauling the young man up by his collar and throwing him bodily into a deep snowdrift. His knife was in his hand now, drawn in a single, fluid motion. The second man, the wiry one, lunged with a blade of his own, but Cale was already turning, moving inside the arc of the swing. Steel met flesh. A choked scream. The second man crumpled to his knees, blood staining the snow, a dark, shocking crimson from a deep gash in his thigh. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was the end of his fight. Jedediah Thorne stood alone now, his pistol finally in his hand, his face a mask of pale shock. He looked at Cale, then at Ilara with her smoking rifle, then at the spreading stain of blood in the snow. Whatever false courage had brought him here evaporated into the frigid air. Cale said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "Go. You walk away now, or you stay here and are buried." Thorne hesitated for a heartbeat, then began to back away. His boots made no sound now, only retreat. He abandoned his companions to their fate. Whether they crawled home or froze did not concern him. When the trees had swallowed him, Cale finally turned back to Ilara. Her rifle was lowered, her breathing coming in ragged, painful gasps. "You were right. They came." He walked towards her slowly, his hand dripping with blood that was not his own. She reached out and touched his wrist. He did not pull away.
"I am not ashamed," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. "Of you. Of this." He looked deep into her eyes, and for the first time she saw something inside him break. It was not his hardness, but his restraint. It was the way a man breaks when he finally realizes the thing he has been protecting no longer needs his protection. It simply needs him. "I would have died for you," he said, the words raw. "You lived for me," she answered. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. The wind began to howl again, but its voice was different now. It was not a threat, it was a release. Later, after they had bound the injured men's wounds and sent them away on their horses, pointing them down the long trail home, Ilara found Kale by the stream, washing his blade in the icy water. The blood came away easily. The storm inside him did not. "You have seen worse than this," she said quietly. "Yes," he answered, not looking at her. "But I never wanted to bring it to your door." "You didn't." She stood beside him, her hands clasped before her. "So let's not allow it to stay." He looked at her then, his eyes clear and steady. "We will rebuild the fence tomorrow." "We will rebuild everything," she said. He nodded, and for the first time since she had met him, he smiled. A true, unguarded smile, a glimpse of the man he might have been before all the storms had come for them both.